all together is good. I just wonder if you like me. I can show you my love, here it is. Don't be shy again. Oh my darling, you're right. Truly I have sweet song tonight, 'cause I wanted to stay overnight. Don't
2,000 years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m., 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. the next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later. Later that same evening, several days later. 6 months later, 2 hours later. 1 minute, 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. The next day, 10 seconds later. 346 minutes later. Much later. 3 days later. Opening night. Later, 3,000 years later, 3 days later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning. With